It is 6 a.m. on an ordinary Tuesday. Somewhere, a woman wakes up beside her husband. She reaches over. He is not there. Not gone to work early. Not in the bathroom. Simply, silently, completely gone. And within the hour, she will discover that every man on Earth has vanished at the exact same moment, without warning, without explanation, without a single trace left behind. Every father, every son, every brother, every stranger on every street corner. Roughly half of 8 billion human beings gone in an instant. What actually happens next? Not in a movie. Not as a thought experiment about gender politics. What genuinely, mechanically, catastrophically happens to a civilization when half its population disappears simultaneously, and that half happens to hold the overwhelming majority of the roles that keep the physical infrastructure of modern life running? The answer is far more complicated, far more immediate, and far more revealing than most people expect. Let's start with the first hour, because the first hour is almost unimaginably chaotic in ways that have nothing to do with grief yet. Grief comes later. The first hour is pure mechanical failure. Airplanes. At any given moment, roughly 9,000 commercial flights are in the air somewhere over the Earth. The overwhelming majority of commercial airline pilots worldwide are men. Statistics from the International Society of Women Airline Pilots indicate that women make up less than 6% of commercial pilots globally. In the instant of vanishing, a significant percentage of those 9,000 aircraft lose their pilots mid-flight. Some have a female co-pilot or first officer capable of taking control. Many do not. Within that first hour, the skies above the Earth become the site of one of the largest simultaneous mass casualty events in human history, entirely disconnected from any war, disease, or natural disaster. Purely a consequence of who happened to be sitting in the cockpit. Ships at sea face a similar reckoning. The maritime shipping industry, responsible for carrying roughly 90% of world trade, is overwhelmingly staffed by men. The International Chamber of Shipping estimates that women make up around 2% of the global maritime workforce. Massive container ships, oil tankers, and cargo vessels, many operating with skeleton crews already, lose captains, navigators, and engine room staff simultaneously. Some of these vessels are carrying volatile cargo. Some are near coastlines. The consequences ripple outward over the following days as ships run aground, drift into shipping lanes, or in worse cases, collide. Now consider what is happening on the ground in the same first hour. Power plants. The global electricity supply is maintained by a workforce that, according to data from the International Energy Agency, remains roughly 80% male, and in the specific, highly technical roles of nuclear reactor operation and grid stability management, that percentage climbs even higher in many countries. Nuclear power plants are designed with substantial redundancy and automated fail-safes precisely because human error is already a known risk. But automated fail-safes are built to handle malfunction, not the complete, simultaneous disappearance of trained operators. In the immediate hours following the vanishing, nuclear facilities around the world would be relying entirely on whatever automated shutdown protocols exist, and on whichever remaining female staff, if any, happen to be present and capable of manually executing emergency procedures they may never have been the primary operator for. This is the uncomfortable, unavoidable truth sitting at the center of this entire hypothetical, and it is worth saying plainly before going any further. This is not a question of capability. Women are not less capable than men of flying planes, running power grids, or operating heavy machinery. This is a question of current, present-day representation, built up over a century of specific historical, economic, and social patterns that determined who was trained for which jobs. The scenario is not exposing a truth about ability. It is exposing a truth about existing structural distribution and the sheer scale of infrastructure that currently depends on one demographic being present in overwhelming numbers. By the end of day one, the picture becomes clearer and grimmer. Emergency services face a similar imbalance. According to the National Fire Protection Association, women make up roughly 9% of career firefighters in the United States. Police forces worldwide remain majority male, though the ratio varies more by country, generally somewhere between 12 and 25% female in most developed nations. Construction, currently maintaining roads, water systems, and physical infrastructure, is over 90% male in most industrialized economies, according to labor. None of this means these systems collapse instantly and completely. It means they become critically understaffed at precisely the moment they are most needed, because the vanishing itself and the immediate aftermath generates enormous emergency demand. Fires from unattended equipment, car accidents from vehicles suddenly missing drivers mid-transit, medical emergencies among people experiencing catastrophic psychological shock. All of this occurring simultaneously, addressed by a workforce reduced dramatically in the exact sectors designed to respond to crisis. Now, the grief. Try to imagine the sheer psychological scale of this event. Every woman who had a father, a husband, a son, a brother, a male friend, a male colleague she cared about, experiences profound loss simultaneously. This is not comparable to any war, any pandemic, any natural disaster in human history, because none of those events removed an entire, specific half of humanity in a single instant. Everywhere, all at once, with zero warning and zero explanation. Psychologists who study collective trauma, including researchers building on the foundational work of Dr. Judith Herman, whose influential work on trauma and recovery has shaped modern understanding of mass psychological injury, would likely describe this as an unprecedented category of event. Herman's research distinguishes between individual trauma and what she terms complex collective trauma, events that damage not just individuals but the fabric of social trust and shared reality itself. The vanishing would represent collective trauma at a scale with no historical precedent, because it is simultaneously a personal loss for nearly every remaining human being and a civilizational, infrastructural catastrophe occurring at exactly the same moment those same people are trying to process unimaginable grief. There would be no time to properly grieve, because the lights are flickering, the water systems are failing in some regions, and someone has to figure out how to keep the emergency room running with half the surgical staff simply gone. Let's move further out. What happens in the weeks and months that follow? Here, something genuinely fascinating and counterintuitive begins to emerge from the historical and sociological record. Though this thought experiment has no direct precedent, the closest historical parallel researchers point to is the demographic aftermath of major wars, particularly the aftermath of the two world wars, when substantial percentages of working-age men in several countries were killed or severely wounded, leaving women to rapidly fill roles they had previously been excluded from. Historian Penny Summerfield, who has extensively studied the British homefront during the Second World War, documented how quickly and effectively British women moved into roles in factories, agriculture, transportation, and even some technical and engineering positions that had been almost exclusively male before the war. Within a remarkably short period, measured in months rather than years, production quotas that had seemed dependent on a male workforce were being met, and in some documented cases exceeded by women who had received compressed rapid training. This does not mean the transition following our hypothetical vanishing would be smooth or painless. The scale here is entirely different, total rather than partial, instantaneous rather than gradual, and occurring alongside catastrophic infrastructure failure rather than a mobilized, organized, wartime economy with functioning government coordination. But it does suggest something important. Human societies, and particularly the surviving population in a crisis of this magnitude, demonstrate a documented capacity to rapidly retrain and redistribute labor when the alternative is systemic collapse. Agriculture presents one of the more genuinely dangerous long-term problems. According to data from the Food and Agriculture Organization, roughly 43% of the agricultural labor force worldwide is female. But the operation of large-scale industrial farming equipment, the specific machinery responsible for the majority of caloric production in developed nations, skews heavily male in terms of who currently operates it. The concern here is not permanent. It is the transition period. Someone has to learn, quickly, how to operate combine harvesters and industrial irrigation systems at the exact scale needed to feed a population of nearly 4 billion remaining people, during a period when the existing supply chains, largely dependent on male-dominated trucking and logistics networks, are simultaneously in crisis. The trucking industry alone, responsible for moving the overwhelming majority of food and goods within most countries, remains, according to data from the American Trucking Associations, over 90% male in the United States specifically, with similar patterns globally. The first several months following the vanishing would likely see serious regional food distribution crises, not because there is insufficient food produced globally, but because the specific logistics chain, moving that food from farm to store to household, is critically understaffed at precisely the roles required to keep it moving. Now consider something that receives less attention in popular versions of this thought experiment: reproduction and the long-term survival of the human species. With the entire male population gone, natural human reproduction, as it has existed throughout all of recorded history, ends immediately. This is where the scenario intersects directly with existing reproductive technology. Sperm banks currently store frozen genetic material collected from millions of donors globally, and this stored material would become, almost overnight, one of the most consequential resources on the planet. Fertility clinics and reproductive medicine specialists, a field that notably, according to data from the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, is actually majority female among practicing reproductive endocrinologists, would find themselves managing not just individual family planning, but a question of species continuation. The math here matters enormously. Existing frozen sperm supplies, while substantial, were collected under normal demand assumptions, not under a scenario requiring them to become the sole source of genetic material for continuing human reproduction indefinitely. Geneticists studying population bottlenecks, a well-documented phenomenon in evolutionary biology where a species' genetic diversity collapses due to a dramatic reduction in breeding population, would likely raise serious concerns about long-term genetic diversity if reproduction became dependent on a limited existing supply of frozen genetic material from a finite number of donors. This single detail transforms the entire nature of the crisis. It is not simply an economic and infrastructural collapse to be managed and eventually stabilized. It becomes, within a generation, an existential question about whether human reproduction can continue at a scale and genetic diversity sufficient to sustain a healthy, viable population moving forward. What would emerge from this, assuming humanity survives the initial catastrophic transition period, is almost certainly a civilization unrecognizable from the one that existed the day before the vanishing. Every institution built around assumed gender ratios would need to be entirely reconstructed. Every technical field would need emergency, accelerated training programs to fill catastrophic labor gaps. Government structures, militaries, entire economic systems built on specific role distributions accumulated over centuries would need to reorganize from the ground up, simultaneously, everywhere on Earth, at once. And underlying every practical, mechanical, logistical challenge would be something that no amount of infrastructure repair could address. Roughly 4 billion women and the surviving children too young to have been affected, carrying a form of grief that has literally never existed in human history before this moment. Not a grief for the dead, in the way humanity has always understood death and mourning. A grief for an entire half of humanity that did not die in any conventional sense, but simply stopped existing, everywhere, all at once, with no closure, no explanation, no grave to visit, and no body ever found, because there was never a body to begin with. It is 6 a.m. on an ordinary Tuesday. A woman wakes up beside her husband. He is there, breathing quietly beside her, the way he has been every morning for years. She has no idea how close, in some other version of this exact moment, that ordinary fact came to being the single strangest and most catastrophic thing that has ever happened to the human species.